the themes that, along with optimism, that the field was going to build on. So the origins of the concept itself go back again to the 1970s, and I would try to refer to Mike as Csikszentmihalyi or Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, but I know I'm going to slip. So just know that I was his graduate student before I was a faculty member at Claremont. So it's a habit. So when Mike was a graduate student himself at the University of Chicago, he was interested in creativity at a time when that was not a particularly popular thing to study. And he was studying visual artists, so painters and art students. And he was really interested in something that he observed when he was doing his doctoral work, which was that these artists were so deeply engaged in the work that they were doing. And then they were so completely disinterested in the work when it was done. So they would abandon the canvas in a corner of the room and move on to the next work of art. And from a motivational perspective, that was really hard to explain with the theoretical tools of that era of psychology. And so the question that he had was, why do artists do what they do? And so the intellectual context is kind of important to understand, and the way that it intersects with both the research that Mike was doing at the time as a graduate student, like some of you, and also his own kind of intellectual background. So at the time that he was a graduate student, the perspectives on psychology that were influential included behaviorism, and psychoanalysis or depth psychology. And in these theories, there was very little room for the self, so the conscious agentic self, and there was very little room for activity done for its own rewards, initiated by the self. And so that was the starting point. And the way that he saw what he was doing when he turned to the question of intrinsic motivation was trying to understand its phenomenology. So those artists who were abandoning their work as soon as it was done, what was the experience that they were having as they were engaged in the creative process? And how do we more generally, all of us, experience the things that we find intrinsically rewarding? So that's kind of the intellectual context, a backdrop against which it was hard to find a way to explain intrinsically motivated behavior. And I could just, without going into Mike's biography, because of his experience in growing up in Europe during the war, I think he was particularly sensitive to the importance of individuals' own ability to shape the experiences that they have. Okay, so that's a little bit about the context and also where flow fits into positive psychology. And I wanted to before going into sort of the theoretical framework, talk a little bit about what the experience itself is like by giving you some examples from early research and from some research that we did with scientists as part of a completely different line of work. So here's a dancer from the original studies. This is the very first study that was done where the construct of flow sort of came into focus. And it's a dancer saying your concentration is very complete. Your mind isn't wandering. You're not thinking of something else. You're totally involved in what you're doing. This is a physical activity. So your body feels good. Your energy is flowing very smoothly. You feel relaxed, comfortable, and energetic. And then here's a second description of flow, although clearly the scientists didn't know anything about flow. And this was a cell biologist whose main activity was studying cells through the microscope. And I just point you particularly to the last sentence of this, where he's saying, after saying that he can sit in front of a microscope for 3 or 4 hours at a time, he says, I can probably be very disconcerting to other people in the degree to which I can concentrate on something and not pay much attention to what's going on around me. So in both of those descriptions, one a very cognitive activity and one a very embodied activity, you get that sense of the full awareness of focused on the present moment and the activity that the person is engaged in. Okay, so that's a little bit about the flow experience, and you can think about how what activities, because I'm going to ask you this later, what activities you may have experienced this in, or if now that you see these descriptions, you want to know a little bit more about how the flow experience was conceptualized based on the early interviews that the dancer quote is part of. So here's a representation of the dimensions that Csikszentmihalyi and his colleagues identified in those early interview studies. So they were studying things like dancers and basketball players and chess players and rock climbers. I'm going to talk first about the elements that are on the outside of this circle, which are characteristics of what it feels like to be in a flow state. And then I'm going to turn to the three things at the center of this figure, which might call the conditions of flow. Okay, so I'm going to go through these, and I think for those of you who have maybe read about flow or studied it, or I think there are at least some of you who are doing research that involves the concept, some of this will be very familiar. So what I'm going to try to do is highlight the things that I think are somewhat nuanced and I think can be interpreted in different ways. So I'm going to try to illustrate with quotes, and some of these are quotes that Mike and I used in teaching positive psychology here, and they're from the early interview studies, so qualitative research. So this is maybe the heart of the flow concept, and it's cognitive, and that's this notion that the person is fully present and fully focusing their attention on the task at hand, whatever that might be, the activity that they're engaged in. So here, I'm not going to read these quotes, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to read them while I comment on a couple of features of each of the dimensions. So here, the thing that I would want to highlight is that there's this emphasis on full concentration, but it's not forced concentration. So we all know the experience of trying to concentrate on something that is not captivating our attention. And that's almost the opposite of concentration in the flow state. It's sometimes called effortless attention because subjectively, even if actually it requires quite a bit of cognitive or physical effort, it feels like you're concentrating effortlessly. So that's a way in which this construct might be a little bit different than it might seem. So full concentration, the first of the dimensions. And then the idea that action and awareness merge when a person is experiencing the flow state. So what does this mean? It doesn't mean that the person is on autopilot in the way that we sometimes are when we're driving a familiar route and we get to the destination and we don't remember anything about having driven. That's a case where the activity is so automated that it doesn't require us to be present at all. And we're really kind of using a tiny amount of our attention to monitor the driving. And mostly we're doing something else with our minds. But instead, it's the idea that the activity is unfolding fluently and you're not stepping outside of the activity to observe it, but what you're doing and what your attention is focused on are unified. They're one. So here are a couple of quotes, one from a rock climber. Well, one quote from a rock climber about this idea of being in the experience, not outside the experience, and watching it. Okay, and then the notion that self-consciousness disappears, and here are a couple of quotes, one from a surgeon and one from a basketball player. And this is not the notion that you become unconscious, but the notion that your awareness and your consciousness of self only extends to the part of the self that's engaged in the activity. And I particularly like the second quote here, because I think we all know how having things go badly can take you out of this immersion in an experience. But this basketball player is pointing out that when things are going really well, if you notice that, you're also you're going to step out of the experience. But this is a characteristic of the flow state that I think is one that people use to recognize when they've been in flow, which is this notion that they've kind of lost awareness of the self that is often monitoring and questioning what's going on. The perception of control in the sense of freedom from worry about failure. And again, there's something that this doesn't mean. And it doesn't mean an objective total control of the situation. Because if you think about it, those are situations where whatever the activity is, it's so well learned that there's no suspense about how it's going to unfold and no real need to fully pay attention. So it's a sense that you are in control of something where you could easily not be in control, rather than something that's so overlearned that there's no possibility of failure. So that's the dimension of sense of control. And then another dimension that people often use to sort of identify when they've been in flow is this notion that they lose track of time. And so here's a passage from a dancer who's recognizing that there can be two different kinds of things that happen. And one is that time constricts, and it seems like it's passed really quickly. It's a very familiar experience, and one that is the more common of these two. The second one is that sometimes it can seem like time expands. And athletes often talk about this. They might say that a batter might say that the ball seemed like it was coming towards them in slow motion, and making contact was so much easier because of that. So that's the dimension of time distortion. And then the characteristics of the flow state, the last one of these is this notion of intrinsic reward, the notion that the experience itself is the reason to engage in the activity. And Mike originally called flow the autotelic experience because of this notion that the goal is the experience itself. And those are a couple of passages that describe that, one from a rock climber and one from a surgeon. So you should be getting you should be noticing that the activities can be quite different from each other, and the experience is a kind of a common denominator. So there's one last example of making the contrast between those experiential rewards and extrinsic rewards that can come from an activity. Okay, so those are the dimensions of the subjective experience that a person has when they feel like they're in flow. And those go all the way back to the original interview research, as do these three proximal conditions, proximal in the sense that they're right there in the moment as you experience flow, making it possible and allowing the experience to extend over time. So I'll talk briefly about each of those as well. But I want to show first an example, and this is a rock climber. It's actually a very eminent rock climber, climbing a very difficult rock. And he's literally upside down and holding on with his fingertips. And I think rock climbing is a great example of how those three conditions that are conducive to flow play out. So if you take a look at this and you imagine this rock climber trying to get up this, one of the most difficult ascents that anyone has done. So here's the first of the conditions, and it's that there are clear goals all along the way as you go. So that means that the goals are in the moment. So if we go back and look at this rock climber, it's where is he going to put his hand next? And is that hold going to be stable? And where is he going to put his foot next? So that's this notion that the goals are there in the moment, leading the person through the activity, not that he has a goal to get to the top of the rock, but that he has goals that are regulating or guiding his action as he goes. In the same way, there's immediate feedback to one's actions. So this isn't the feedback that you get when you get a grade on your paper, a week after you've finished it. But this is the feedback that you get in the moment when you play a chord, or when you take when you are moving your hand up the rock. The immediate feedback that you get from the action based on the micro outcome that it has. And then finally, and this is the condition that I think is probably best known, it's the one that's been studied the most for sure, and that's that there's a balance between the challenges or opportunities for action that you perceive in the situation and the capacities for action or the skills that you bring to it. And so I don't know if that rock climber is in flow, or if he's actually maybe in a state of anxiety. But the task at hand is stretching the person's capacities. And that's that notion of sort of a harmony between the challenges in the situation and the skills that a person brings to it. So just there's the rock climber again. And so that gives you a little bit of a sense of each of the dimensions of flow, some of the ways that maybe because, we're using a word sometimes to characterize the dimension, some of the ways in which they can be distinguished from other very similar uses of the same term. So I've already talked a little bit about this, but we could ask the question, why flow is important? And one way to answer that question is to talk about the research that has looked at outcomes of experiencing flow, whether that's through laboratory experiments. There's lots of laboratory experiments having people play Tetris, or through experience sampling studies about people's daily lives. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, or through other kinds of like survey studies and traditional psychological methods. So we know from that research that flow is associated with higher positive affect, lower negative affect. And there's a very interesting set of studies where they looked at people who were going to have to wait months to find out the results of like exams at the end of to enter the medical or legal profession in the United States. And they found that having people engage in flow activities was a way of reducing their negative affect and their worry about the outcomes that they couldn't do anything about while they were waiting, and increase positive affect. Also associated with better performance in sports and games. And then two areas where flow has been of great interest because they're actually domains where workers are often very disengaged at work, and students are unfortunately often quite disengaged in the classroom. So it's been of great interest to find that flow is connected to things like job commitment and work satisfaction, as well as outcomes that contribute to the work that's done, like creativity, and also the educational outcomes like learning and exploratory behavior are fostered by experiencing flow. So that's one kind of answer. And that's an answer in terms of the things that the experience of flow is connected to. And often it's connected to those because flow is intrinsically rewarding, and therefore it encourages people to continue to engage in the activity. So beyond performance and productivity, though, there is a thing that I've been stressing sort of all along, which is the experience itself. And Mike sometimes called flow the phenomenology of play. And from an evolutionary standpoint, we could also talk about the importance of flow as lying in the fact, as situated in the fact that it encourages us to play. And play is adaptive in the sense that it's a way of exploring, building skills, forging bonds with others. And that's true sort of all species and at all ages. And flow has actually been studied the most in teenagers and adults, not so much in children, not so much in older adults, but the evidence that we have is that flow is experienced at all ages, and we can sort of see from an evolutionary perspective why that would be desirable. The other reason has to do with the psychology of attention that's in the title of this talk. And that's the idea. And these are ideas that Mike has written about quite a bit. So if you've read his work, you'll have encountered these ideas. I sometimes think that attention is really one of the strongest through lines if you were to read across the whole body of his writing and research. And these would be kind of basic principles for him. And one is that attention determines what information, broadly defined, is going to enter your awareness and what's going to be excluded from it. And William James, who was very influential in this work on flow and in the broader perspective it's part of, made the point that your experience is what you agree to attend to. And only the things that you notice, that you give your attention to, are going to shape consciousness. And so attention determines what we experience, and it determines what we do. So that's the first point, that attention is a resource. The second point is that it's a finite resource. And what that means is that we have a limited amount of attention at any given moment to invest. And also, over the course of our lives, we have a limited amount of attention to invest. And that means that what we're able to experience and what we're able to do is also limited in that same way. And today in particular, and I think Dr. Dubin will talk about this next week, the claims on our attention are constant, and they have a tendency to fragment our attention. And beyond that, attention has been increasingly commodified in the sense that people have gotten savvy, more and more savvy about learning to capture our attention. So it's a finite resource, and it's harder for us to manage. So if how we selectively invest this limited resource will shape our lives, flow becomes really important because it is an experience of enjoyable absorption of our attention in an activity that is inviting us to utilize our capacities, our skills fully. I mean, you can think about it in contrast to other kinds of experiential states that are part of our daily life and that are associated with divided attention or even with inattention. And those include anxiety, kind of anxiety that students feel when they're taking exams, for example, boredom, the kind of experience that students might feel when they're listening to a lecture that they're not interested in, and apathy, which is kind of the full withdrawal from an experience. So in the interest of time, I'm going to talk just very briefly about some of these topics here in the middle of the talk. And one of these is how flow has been studied. And I mention it primarily because, I mean, this is a little bit of a dilemma. Flow is an experience where the self is no longer aware of itself. And it's an experience that people are loath to interrupt. So the earliest studies used interview methods. People reflected on an activity that they engaged in and that was a source of flow and tried to describe their experience. Much of the current research uses one of an increasingly large number of self-report scales that measure flow either as a single construct or the different dimensions of it. The experience sampling method I'll talk more about because in some ways I think that kind of rivals flow as one of Mike's most important contributions to psychology and is very closely connected to the study of flow. There's also been research, particularly with children, using observational methods. And there's very active interest in using a variety of neurophysiological techniques to study the neural and physiological correlates of flow. So this is the flow questionnaire. This is an early way of studying flow. So you would ask people to read this passage, which is based on those early interviews. It just draws quotes directly from it. So it gives you a feel from the experience of other people of what is intended by flow. And then the follow-up questions are, is this experience familiar to you? And in what activities have you experienced it? And then the experience sampling method was developed to try to capture experiences on the fly. So today it's used by sending a survey to people's phones, and they stop what they're doing for a minute or two, fill it out, and give you a little snapshot of their experience. So people who study emotion use this method a lot because they can capture emotions in the moment instead of later. And this is a very early example of an experience sampling form from a student not happy in their English class. But what's particularly useful for you here in relation to flow is to see the items that would be used if you were gonna measure flow in people's, for example, this teenagers' day-to-day experience. So you can see some items that are about dimensions of flow, like how well you're concentrating and how self-conscious you felt. And you can also see questions about the challenges and skills in the activity, which could be used to understand the conditions of flow, right? So thinking back to the description of those different 9 dimensions, that balance of challenges and skills in the moment could be measured with those 2 items, and the state, the sort of how it feels, could be measured with the items on the left. And because I will come back to this at the very end of the talk in relation to some of the research that we've done, those measures of how many challenges you see in the activity and how many skills you feel you have in the activity, those can be used to identify the experiences where flow is most likely, where the state of flow is most likely, because challenges and skills are simultaneously high. So those are the experiences where the conditions might stretch you enough to focus your attention and allow you to experience flow. Okay, so some of the kinds of things that have been studied and that you might be wondering about are how often flow is actually experienced and who experiences it. So is it only elite rock climbers who experience it and surgeons, or is this something that's experienced more often? So this is really one of the very earliest attempts on a large scale to get a sense of how pervasive the experience of flow is and how frequently it's experienced by people who do experience it. And you can see that 12% of the people say this is not an experience that I have based on this very short description. And it ranges all the way to about a quarter of people who say that they experience it often. So on this question of the frequency of the experience, there is interesting research using the flow questionnaire that I showed you, so that passage, that suggests that teenagers, there's a larger percentage of teenagers who don't recognize the experience than there are adults. And this is research that's been done in a variety of different countries rather than only in a single country like this one. It's survey response. And it's an experience that is reported in every culture that's been studied. It's reported across the lifespan. A former student looked at longitudinal data to try to see if it was experienced, if it fluctuated over the lifespan, and at least across adulthood, it didn't fluctuate very much. Both genders, across occupations, and in many different activities, which leads me to the factors that contribute to experiencing flow, which were already discussed by Mike Csikszentmihalyi in the 1975 book, and included those flow conditions that we've talked quite a bit about, the 3 flow conditions, including the balance of challenge and skill, flow activities, and then something that he really didn't study in 1975, but hypothesized must also be a phenomenon, which is people who are more prone to flow, or what he was calling at that time autotelic personality. So the idea that there are some activities that are conducive to flow was present from the very beginning of the study of flow. And those are activities that have some of those features that I've been talking about, like they tend to have clear goals, they tend to focus your attention on sort of a limited scope. And they tend to give you instant feedback. So actually Tetris is a brilliant choice for laboratory research on flow because it has those characteristics. It's not maybe the kind of elevated experiences that you might think of when you think of like flow in prayer or flow in writing or flow in a deep conversation with another person. Tetris might not be like that. But it is an activity that very predictably, if the person's challenges and skills match, can drop them into the flow state. And then there is increasingly research on autotelic personality. And here's one example of a questionnaire that was developed by a former student here, looking at possible different dimensions suggested by the literature on flow that might make a person more likely or prone to experience flow. And the research shows a number of correlates of higher autotelic personality, including various aspects of well-being and various aspects of proactive behavior like career search. So a very closely related question is whether flow can be cultivated or not. And here are some of the approaches that have received attention. And this I'm just going to lightly touch on because I think, again, Matt Dubin will talk about this next week based on research that he's done. So one way is to cultivate those proximal flow conditions, the conditions of the person's relationship to the environment, not trying to target the inner state in the same way that it's more productive to focus on the activities that one engages in and what one does for others, rather than trying to target one's and increase one's own happiness by directly focusing on it. Optimizing possible catalysts of getting into flow. People have looked at mindful awareness or with mindfulness interventions. The research on that is still developing, or removing possible barriers to entering flow. And then, of course, identifying activities that are a source of flow or supporting others in doing so. And there have been educational interventions that have tried to cultivate students' awareness of flow, their own personal flow activities. And one of the things that I always try to emphasize in positive psychology is that there's the sort of both and of human functioning, which is that there are positive sides of things that we think of as negative, and there are negative sides of things that we think of as positive. And there has been work done on the dark sides of flow. And these three features, neglect of other domains of life, dependence, or people are often very interested in whether you can be addicted to flow activities, and a tendency to risk taking. Those are very tightly connected to dimensions of the flow state itself. So that sort of focusing of attention and getting sort of lost in the experience, kind of connected to that potential to neglect other domains of life. The intrinsic rewards of the experience can be connected to becoming addicted, I'm putting that in quotes, to the activity. And sense of control can lead to a sense of efficacy, which at least in people who are very new to an activity, can lead to risky behavior. And finally, Mike recognized from the very beginning that you can find flow, people can find flow in harmful activities. It can be experienced in the context of combat. There was a study of teenagers who set fires and who described it as a flow activity. And Mike said from the very beginning that the challenges that can engage one's skills are amoral. They don't have a built-in, there's nothing built in to the activities that can provide flow that makes them positive. So a question that I have, and this is where I want to close, is the question of whether flow, what's the relationship between flow and activities that are not harmful, but instead are pro-social? And we've looked at that in the context of research that we did on a group of adults who we studied with the experience sampling method that you've now seen, what those sheets are that people fill out. And we wanted to try to understand the meaning and purpose that you derive from pro-social activity. And these are people who were devoting a huge amount of time after a retirement, either to volunteering or even to leading organizations that were, providing healthcare access or educational access or food access, all kinds of things that were contributing to their communities. If somebody's doing that, the meaning and purpose that they feel could enable them potentially to engage in an activity, even if in the moment it's not very positive. So it's a legitimate question to ask to what extent flow is experienced in those contexts. And you can see here what was maybe a bit of a surprise for us. And the lower pie chart is the pro-social activity and how their time engaging in the pro-social activity is distributed across those 4 quadrants. The green is the flow quadrant where challenges and skills are high. So that was by far the most common thing that they reported about their engagement in the pro-social activity, was that they were both being stretched and that they were using a lot of skills. But you could also ask, and this is where I will stop, is to what extent flow was being experienced. So that state of flow. So we did find that there was a tremendous increase in sense of meaning and purpose when these people were actively engaged in the pro-social activity. So remember, they're reporting from the moment. These aren't their sort of global conceptions about their experience. So compared to the rest of their daily life, they were filled with a sense of meaning and purpose, but they also had a stronger sense of flow. And so it wasn't just that they were being challenged and stretched, but they were experiencing that state of concentration and enjoyment that we associate with being in flow. And their motivation in the moment was actually more strongly linked to flow than to that sense of meaning and purpose in the moment. I think I'm going to skip over this. If you have questions about directions in the current directions in flow research, I am happy to talk about this. I'll just say some of the areas where a lot of research is being done in flow are in the field of neuroscience, where there's no really there's very interesting theories and there's very interesting findings. It's not my area. But the findings are still kind of settling in that space. Social flow or collective flow, tremendous amount of interest in that extension of flow. And then finally, and this is maybe a little more aspirational, flow in the context of activities that contribute to the community or society or the planet. There's some work that's a little bit of work that's being done on that topic. So I'm going to end, I started with Mike, I'm going to end with a quote from not his book Flow, but his book The Evolving Self, in which he said, "A harmonious evolution is dependent on our ability to invest psychic energy," which is another phrase or term he used for attention, in the future, by which he meant sort of broadly the future. So although flow has been in positive psychology up to this point very much focused on as a way to create optimal experiences for individuals and to contribute to a good life, Mike was also very clear about the fact that it could have a role to play in constructing societies and cultures that were positive. So I'll end there and I'll thank you for your attention. I've told you how valuable our attention is, and see if you have any questions that I can take.
Thank you, Jeanne, for this insightful session. Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Professor Jeanne, it was a very interesting.
Okay, so I didn't really get a chance because I got a little bit concerned about time. I didn't get a chance to ask about your flow activities, but I would love, since I can now see chat again, to hear what activities you were thinking of as you were listening to these descriptions of the experience of being in flow. So if you don't mind to use chat to share that, I would love to see what you mentioned, because one of the things that this research suggests is that pretty much any activity has probably been a flow activity for someone. And although there are certain activities like sports and games that seem like they were designed to provide flow, it's unpredictable what are actually people's sources of flow. So if anybody wants to share that, and meanwhile, I'm happy to answer questions if you have any questions.
Yeah, hello, Jeanne. May I ask a question? Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, Jeanne, my question is like, how do you see this emotion regulation and flow are connected?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear. What and flow?
My question is like, is there any connection between emotion regulation and flow? Like,
Okay, so I think that's a really interesting question, because Mike sometimes talked about flow as enjoyment, which he did not use that term in the same way that I think we use that term, but he was using it in contrast to pleasure, so sort of hedonic experience. So I think he would say that there's a very close relationship between flow and self-regulation, and maybe a closer relationship between flow and attention regulation than necessarily emotion regulation. Because we haven't talked about this, but some of the things that people have been very interested in as things that you could cultivate that would make it easier to get into flow would be things like attentional habits, right? Like the ability to decide where you're going to direct your attention in the first place. So that's an aspect of self-regulation that's different than emotion regulation. But the way that I think emotion regulation clearly would play in is those experiences that are sort of outside the flow channel. So anxiety, high arousal that's bordering on anxiety, relaxation that starts to verge into being bored and apathetic. Some capacity to move away from those probably needs to be in place before you can move into the flow channel. If you're trying to, so, our hypothesis would be if you adjust the conditions of flow, you may be able to draw yourself into the flow channel. Then you're not directly focusing your attention on down-regulating negative emotions. You're changing the context of your relationship to the environment in a way that could pull you into flow. But I think it's it's a research question, whether being able to better regulate boredom and anxiety would contribute to a person's ability to experience flow. I think it's a great question. It would actually be a very interesting topic for research.
oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm looking at the activities, and I'm really excited to see the conversation is coming up, because the really big areas of that people mention as flow activities are various kinds of productive activities and various kinds of leisure activities. But I constantly feel that deep conversations are a clear source of flow. So I've seen it a couple times. I'm obviously paying attention for it, but okay. Are there any other questions?
How do we cultivate this flow in the form of a clutch state?
Okay. So you must be one of the people who is doing research on this topic. So this is not particularly an area that I know, and maybe you'll want to say a little bit more about that distinction, because I would say the first area that ever took up the concept of flow was sport and leisure research. And there's currently research that's being done that's trying to differentiate, or that has argued that we can differentiate the experience of being in flow from what happens when you're if you notice the term, in a sort of a clutch situation, and the experience that you have when you're in that. So can you say a little bit more about that, both for others and for me?
Like, whatever I'm good at, I'm more likely to get into a flow state in that particular activity. But there are many things which I want to do, but I'm not motivated to do. So I would rather practice this so that I get into that clutch state in doing things which are right, which are required to be done.
Yeah, so do you want to say what you mean by clutch state?
Clutch state is trying to get into the same kind of flow state in doing activities which I'm not good at, which I would like to probably, upskill myself. I would like to, get into that uncharted waters where I can actually experience the same kind of flow in things which I don't like to do, but which needs to be done.
Yeah. So I would first go to the same set of things that I was mentioning just in the last response, which are those proximal conditions. So, one thing that you can do in a situation is work on your skills. And the other thing that you can do is constrain the challenges, like reduce the challenges. This is actually a really hard question that you're asking. Every year in the introductory course for our graduate students on positive psychology that I teach, we ask them to try to try to notice something that they do every day that they don't like to do, and then to try to engineer a flow experience in that activity. And it is so hard for people to do. It's exactly what you're asking, I think. And this is slightly heartbreaking to me, but half the class will always try to change studying into a flow activity. And the other half of the class will try to change chores into a flow activity, and it's so difficult. So you're asking a really hard question, and if I had a little more time to talk about the interventions, I would have said, they've done analyses of the research, and clearly we need more very rigorous intervention studies about how to cultivate flow. But there's tons of studies that don't find effects, with things that they, have good reason to think might be ways of cultivating flow. So that would be my first answer, is like look for ways to adjust the conditions. But then I'm just going to tell you a story about somebody who was successful turning studying, which I'm saying it's heartbreaking because I'm sorry that half the students in the class are having to try to make flow make learning more engaging. A student who hit on the idea of taking, I won't say what subject matter it was, taking that subject matter and turning around and teaching it to somebody else. So they transform what the challenge is, right? And that tends to be the context in which people have the most success. I think it's still the same thing. He's learning statistics, he's learning the subject matter, but he's changed what the challenge is, right? So a different set of skills come into play. It's much more enjoyable and engaging. One of the things we know about social activities is they increase the positive emotions that you feel in whatever you're doing. So that's an example of, I think, what you're talking about trying to take something that is not engaging and actually make it something that's absorbing and enjoyable and that you get caught up in. So that's quite different from increasing or decreasing the level of challenge, or it's changing the challenge that you see in a situation.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor Jeanne, I know, thank you so much. This is an incredibly informative discussion. I have one question. I'm reading David Yeager's book right now on motivational challenges for the developmental age group of ages 10 to 25. I have many kids in that range. And I'm just sitting with this flow concept and intrinsic motivation and wondering if there's correlations on proximal conditions for developmental age range of an average boy, girl, or person.
Yeah, so the research on adolescence would probably be closest to what you're interested in. And so there's a fair amount of intersection with, you probably know self-determination theory. And so there's a fair amount of intersection, I would say, because they're also interested in intrinsic motivation, right? I mean, they're also interested in how people kind of take on ownership of extrinsic motivation, but they're very interested in intrinsic motivation as well. And so some of the things that people have studied in the flow context are autonomy and providing autonomy, and that's very congruent with what you learn from self-determination theory. But there hasn't been very much research at the younger end of the range that you're describing. It's one of the things that we need more of. And, I mentioned observational methods. Those have been used with children because, you saw that long passage that people have to read before they tell you if they've had a flow experience. So people have used observational methods. So we don't have as strong an understanding of flow in childhood. So if anybody on this call is looking for a research topic, flow in school children at those younger ages would be very interesting to study. It would be very challenging, but it would be very interesting to study. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have more for you on that.
That's great.
Thank you for this session. It was really informative. I did some research on what makes teenagers happy.
Ooh,
And
okay.
yeah. And one of the prominent theme which I got was flow from leisure activities when they involve in swimming, cycling. And the other theme was the second most important was when they have conversation with their best friend and their favorite teacher.
Okay.
Yeah. So I can connect that flow makes teenagers happy indirectly when they have these conversation with their friends, teachers, and when they engage in their leisure activities. Also, what Srihari sir said that how we can, enhance our flow activities. So I feel it might be connected to mindfulness because mindfulness is enhancing your attention, your awareness. So when you enhance your attention and awareness, maybe it would have a positive impact in experiencing more flow. What do you
Yeah,
have to
thank you for both of those comments. And the first one is very congruent with what the research suggests.
Yeah.
So teenagers do tend to report more flow in leisure activities more frequently as a source of flow than, for example, adults do. And thank you for the comment about conversation. I appreciate that. And then tell me your second point again. I wanted to respond to that as well.
Second point, maybe can mindfulness or practicing mindfulness can increase our flow states or our ability to experience flow.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a good candidate, and there's been quite a bit of interest in it, and the research is currently mixed. And part of that is because some of the research is not, the study designs aren't ideal or the samples are small. So I think it's still emerging, but I feel like that's a very reasonable place to look, is something that might change our attentional habits or the sort of routine way that we engage with the world. So I feel like that's a very reasonable hypothesis, but the findings are kind of mixed.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, ma'am. I have a question. It was a very nice session, and it reminds me of my childhood experiences. Like during our childhood, we were so engrossed with our plays and activities that sometimes we have lost contact with time, or sense of time is not there. So yeah, in that situation, your parents are calling you and you're saying 5 minutes, 5 minutes, but that 5 minutes never come, right? So will it be considered as a form of flow? And this is what I wanted to ask.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because we haven't. There's very little research on flow in children, and you could speculate that flow is very common in children. They spend a lot of time playing. They seem fully absorbed in it. And I love the implication that there's that losing track of time already in childhood. So I see that there's still activities appearing. So I think that's it's consistent with the view that children experience flow. I think the question that would hover over it is about and it kind of goes back to the last comment, is the ability to regulate attention, and whether what that looks like in very early childhood. So I think those would be the two observations to be thinking about. But phenomenologically, that sounded like flow.
Thank you.
Thank you for the very engaging session, Professor Jeanne. As you might be guessing from the questions and the interest from the audience, that we were totally engaged, and maybe in some bits we did achieve or experience flow through this session, and we're really grateful for that. So before we close, I would like now one of our research scholars at UMT Lahore, Maheen, to give an official vote of thanks. Maheen, can you please take over?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. I am Maheen, an intern at Reiki Center, UMD. First of all, I would like to propose a heartfelt thank you to the guest speaker on the such an informative and engaging session on flow, the attention of psychology. I have noticed some of your points, like the characteristics and the darker side of flow, and also the flow activities that you have really mentioned here. I totally agree with it. Also, I think that the conceptual and practical examples you have quoted us, I think we experiencing flow in our daily life, but mostly we find it unnoticed. But you have made me truly thinking about these concepts, and I was provoked to do research on this topic in my future. So,
Oh, great.
and I would like to say that thank you for the session. It not only helps me in my research factor, but also it gives me a lot of insights on the flow, which I never noticed before. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank you for those comments, and I'm really excited that you're considering doing some research in this area, because there's so many unanswered questions at this point. So
Thank you everyone for joining. It's pretty late, I understand, for the people joining from the US. So thank you everyone for your time. See you in the next session.
Thank you.
Good, Jeanne.